The heat was the first enemy. A heavy, woolen blanket smothered over Salt Willow Basin before the sun had even cleared the teeth of Black Mesa Draw. It was a heat that promised nothing but snakes and cracked earth. Cora Ashdown, 26 years worn thin, felt it press against the back of her neck as she tested the porch rail. The wood was loose. Everything was loose. She pulled a frayed leather glove tighter, tasting alkali on her lips. Behind her, from the dark interior of the farmhouse, came the sound that structured her days, a dry, racking cough, thin as burlap. Her mother, Martha, drowning in the dust of a land that had already taken her husband. Cora shouldered the weight of it all, the failing ranch, the lingering sickness, the 30-odd head of cattle the drought hadn't starved and the rustlers hadn't stolen. She was a woman trying to hold water in her fists. This spring, the heat felt different. It felt personal. Down in Pinyon Ford, the air was thick with more than just dust. It hummed with rumors, sharp and dangerous as barbed wire. Whispers of army patrols riding too far north of the treaty line, their blue uniforms a nervous shimmer in the distance. Whispers of Ezekiel Danner, a cattle baron whose shadow was long enough to cover 3 counties, pinning new deputy badges on men who'd never known the law, only as payroll. And the worst rumor, a peace detail, sanctioned by some far-off territorial governor, which everyone knew was just a clean word for clearing the basin, clearing it of the Hawk Mesa people who'd always been there, and clearing it of small-time ranchers like her, the ones who refused to sell to Danner for pennies on the dollar. The cough came again, weaker this time. Cora gripped the rail. Just one more season. She prayed to a sky that looked like hammered tin. One good rain, one less visit from Danner's men. But dawn brought no rain. It brought proof. She saw it as the sky turned from bruised purple to a searing white. The top rail of the south paddock was down, not broken by a spooked steer. Cut, the wire snipped clean. Her gelding, Buck, a steady roan that was usually half asleep, was pressed into the far corner of the corral, his head high, nostrils flared, hide twitching. "Easy, boy," she murmured, walking slow. He snorted, shuffling, his eyes rolling toward the pole barn. Cora stopped. She tested the wind. It was coming down from the draw, carrying the usual scents of juniper and hot rock, and something else, something sharp, greasy, and wrong. Not wood smoke, oil. She moved past the skittish gelding, her boots sinking in the deep dust. The pole barn, her father's last project, stood silent. The wide doors were shut. They were never shut. She smelled it clear now, the unmistakable tang of spilled lamp oil, thick enough to mask the familiar scent of hay and horses. Sabotage. The word was cold in her gut. She didn't run. Running spooked horses. She pulled the heavy pin and slid the door along its track. The interior was hot, hazy. A cloud of oily smoke hung in the air. In the center of the walkway, between the stalls, a pile of soaked rags and hay cuttings was blooming with a lazy, yellow-orange flower. A lantern, shattered, lay beside it. It wasn't an accident. It was a fuse. The fire found the spilled oil trail and licked upward with a whoosh, climbing a support post. The horses screamed. It was a sound that tore right through her. "Out, get out." Her voice was a raw croak. Panic was useless. She grabbed the wet blanket hanging by the cistern pump, the one she used for cooling sweats. She plunged it into the trough, soaking it heavy, the cold water shocking her hands. She burst back into the barn, the smoke stinging, immediate. The horses were kicking the stall boards, rearing. "Hya, get!" She swung the heavy blanket, slapping the rump of the nearest mare, driving her toward the door. The mare bolted, eyes white. One. She turned to the next stall. The fire was louder now, a hungry roar. It had found the dry tinder of the hayloft. "Move! Damn you!" she choked, coughing. "Two!" She shoved the third horse, a young colt, bodily toward the opening. He scrambled, slipped, and found his footing, disappearing into the clean morning air. 3. Only the mare. Daisy was left, trapped in the back stall, rearing against the gate. The fire was climbing the wall behind her. The heat so intense Cora's hair felt like it was shrinking against her scalp. Daisy open! The pin was hot. She fumbled it, her gloves smoking. The fire bloomed overhead. A shadow stepped through the wall of smoke, moving with a calm that didn't belong in the inferno. He was lean, soot-streaked, and carried no weapon she could see. A man from Hawk Mesa. His eyes, dark and unreadable, took in the scene in one sweep: the trapped mare, the buckling roof beam. Cora. He didn't speak. He moved past her, grabbed the mare's halter, and used his weight in a single, brutal jerk that snapped the horse's head down and broke her panic. He hauled the animal forward, shoving her past Cora and into the yard. Cora stumbled out after him, gasping, her lungs burning. The man was already scanning the ridgeline. "Who?" she started, coughing, leaning against the corral fence. Shouts snapped from the ridge. Not Hawk Mesa voices. "There they are, look at that savages burning 'em out." 3 riders crested the rise, backlit by the sun, their forms black and menacing. Danner's men. 2 shots cracked the air. Not warning shots. Thwack! Thwack! The bullets slapped the boards just above Cora's head. Splinters, sharp as needles, sprayed her cheek. She cried out, dropping to a crouch. The man from Hawk Mesa hadn't moved. He looked down at her, his face grimed with soot. "They need you dead to make their story true," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of panic. "Move!" Cora's heart seized. The barn was an inferno, the pole roof beginning to fold, sending a geyser of sparks into the sky. But the fire wasn't the threat. The riders were. And her mother. She looked at the farmhouse, the thin curtains drawn against the morning heat. Martha was in there, helpless, with only a dry cough for defense. Torn, the horses in the paddock, her last asset, her mother in the house, her last blood. The riders were coming down the slope, taking their time. They had their story. The man grabbed her arm. "They will burn the house next. Are you dying here?" "My mother," Cora whispered. The word ripped from her raw throat. She made the choice. She sprinted from the corral, ignoring the man, ignoring the bullets that kicked up dust near her feet. She ran to the open paddock where the horses she'd saved were milling in terror. She slammed the heavy gate shut, dropping the bar. They were penned, but they were free of the barn. She raced to the farmhouse porch, ripped the screen door open, and grabbed her father's repeating rifle from the wall pegs. Martha was standing in the doorway, clutching her thin wrapper, her face pale as ash. Cora shoved the heavy rifle into her mother's frail hands. "Ma, listen to me." Martha's eyes were wide, fixed on the approaching riders. "You don't show yourself," Cora commanded, her voice hard. "You stay low, by the window. You hear me?" Martha nodded, her hands trembling on the wood stock. "Fire too if strangers cross the porch. Fire too, and I'll hear you. You understand? Cora, the barn. The barn is gone. Lock this door. Don't open it. Not for anyone but me. Where are you going?" "To live," Cora said. She slammed the farmhouse door, hearing the faint click of the bolt sliding home. The hayloft erupted. A column of fire and smoke punched the sky. The man from Hawk Mesa, Chayton Redbird. She knew his name now. A scout who sometimes traded at the ford was driving the last mare, the one he'd saved, out of the burning structure just as the main roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The mare's flank was singed. Buck, her gelding, was screaming from the corral. A sudden gust of wind, hot and dry, shifted the blaze. Embers, large as a man's fist, skipped across the yard and landed on the dry shake shingle roof of the farmhouse. A small tongue of flame licked up near the chimney. "No!" Cora screamed. She sprinted for the well bucket, her mind blank save for the image of her mother trapped inside. It was futile, a thimble against an ocean of fire, but she had to try. She reached the well, her hands grabbing the rough rope, when a solid weight slammed into her, driving the air from her lungs. It was Chayton. He had shouldered her, not gently, pushing her back from the well, away from the house. "It's too late for the bucket," he said. "My mother, they want you," he interrupted, his gaze fixed on the ridge. The first rider had reached the rise just above the house. He was young Danner's nephew, Silas. He saw them. He raised his carbine, sighting for the easy shot. He had 2 targets, stationary, silhouetted by the inferno. "Run the wash," Chayton ordered. He didn't wait for her. He grabbed the halter of Cora's smoke-dazed gelding. Buck, who was still in the corral. With one motion, he unlatched the gate, vaulted bareback onto the roan, and reached a hand down to her. "Now, Cora." She didn't hesitate. She took his hand and he hauled her up, scrambling to sit astride behind him. The horse, panicked by 2 riders and the roar of the fire, reared. A bullet cracked past her ear. Silas had fired. Chayton kicked the gelding hard, driving him not toward the road, but straight for the steep, crumbling edge of Juniper Wash. "Hold," he grunted. They plunged. It wasn't a ride. It was a controlled fall. The gelding slid on his haunches down the 20-foot embankment of loose shale and gravel, landing hard in the dry riverbed below. Cora slammed against Chayton's back, her arms locked around his waist, her face buried in his soot-covered shirt. Bullets chewed the rim above them, sending chips of sandstone raining down. Thwack, zip, ping. They were out of sight. Chayton spurred the horse, driving him hard down the winding, sandy bottom of the wash, away from the house, away from the riders, away from the pillar of black smoke that was consuming her entire world. Behind them, Salt Willow Basin glowed hell-orange in the morning light. The lie was already spreading, riding faster than they were. By noon, the telegraph at Pinyon Ford would be clicking Ashdown Ranch burned. Indians suspected. The story was true now. Juniper Wash was a wound carved in the earth, a narrow arroyo that funneled the hot spring wind until it felt like the breath of a furnace. The gelding, Buck, was lathered, his breathing a harsh tearing sound that seemed too loud in the tight confines. Cora clung to Chayton Redbird's back, her arms locked around his waist, her cheek pressed against the soot-caked cotton of his shirt. She could feel the tense, economical shift of his muscles as he guided the horse. They were riding double, a heavy load for a horse that had already panicked and fled a fire. But Chayton rode him with a desperate, knowing skill. The hooves didn't thud. They hammered. The sound, a sharp clack-clack clatter on the loose shale, felt like a beacon, a signal of their escape. Cora flinched with every strike, sure that Danner's men on the rimrock above could hear them. The landscape was the enemy, sharp and unforgiving. The walls of the wash were sheer sandstone, offering no easy exit. Thickets of catclaw acacia, all thorn and spite, crowded the narrow passages. A branch whipped past, snagging the skirt of Cora's cotton work dress. She felt the fabric resist, then tear with a sound like a dry sob. The rip ran from hem to knee. She ignored it. The wind immediately bit at her exposed skin, blasting it with sand. She kept riding. Chayton wasn't just riding. He was thinking. He wasn't following the wash, but crossing it, using the patches of bare stone to hide their trail. He urged the gelding up a scree slope, a cascade of small rocks rattling behind them, and onto a narrow ledge of exposed limestone. He followed it for 50 yards before dropping back into a different fork of the dry riverbed, stone on stone. He was breaking their spoor, leaving a puzzle of hoofprints that started and stopped in impossible places. Cora, a rancher born, knew tracking. She knew how to read a trail left in soft earth. This was something else. This was the work of a man who knew the land not as property to be fenced, but as a living thing that could be a lie or traitor. He slowed the horse to a walk, his head canted, listening. The only sounds were the wind and the horse's ragged breath. "They'll follow the smoke," he said, his voice low, pitched just for her. It was the first thing he'd said since Run the Wash. Cora swallowed grit. "They saw us. Silas Danner saw us. He saw 2 people on one horse, running. He has a burned ranch behind him. The smoke is the story he wants. It's the story Danner paid for. They'll follow the smoke back to the basin, to count their victory. They'll wait for us to circle back. They're hunters, not trackers." He was wagering their lives on the posse's arrogance and lack of sense. He was probably right. Danner's nephew and his hired hands were men who knew bottles and branding irons. Not a cold trail. They rode in silence for another hour, the heat climbing, the sun a white-hot eye directly overhead. The wash widened, the walls lowering, but the land grew flatter, more exposed. Chayton finally guided Buck into the shadow of a deep cut bank, overgrown with dusty ironweed. He slid off the gelding's back. His movement was fluid, economical. Cora, stiff and shaking, tried to dismount and nearly fell. He put a hand on her elbow, steadying her. His touch was impersonal, firm. She jerked her arm away. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a hollow, aching void that was quickly filling with rage and a grief so sharp it stole her breath. "My mother," she whispered, the words scraping her raw throat. He didn't answer. He moved to the horse's head, stroking the damp neck, speaking in quiet, low tones she couldn't understand. Hawk Mesa words. She turned away, slamming her palm against the sandstone wall. The rock was hot, stinging her skin. It felt good. "Why?" she spat, the word bitter with dust and fury. "Why did you help me? You owe me nothing. You owe my kind nothing." Chayton finished soothing the horse. He walked past her, brushing through the brittle ironweed, and disappeared around a bend. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he had left her. She was alone, on foot, with her dress in ribbons and Danner's men somewhere behind her. He returned a moment later. "There is a seep. Water the horse. Just let him sip." He held the branches aside for her. Cora stared at him, breathing hard. "You didn't answer me." His eyes, dark and flat, finally met hers. The unreadability was gone, replaced by something ancient and cold. "I owe truth," he said, his voice clipped. "That fire was a lie, and I hate Ezekiel Danner's fires." He turned and walked back to the mouth of the cut bank, taking up a watch. His fires, plural. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't the first. Cora's anger fractured, replaced by a cold dread. She led Buck to the seep. It was barely a patch of damp clay, but by pressing her hand into the mud, a small pool of gritty water collected. She let the horse drink, pulling his head up when he tried to gulp. When the horse was satisfied, she knelt. She looked at her reflection in the tiny, muddy pool. A stranger looked back, face streaked with soot, hair wild, eyes wide with a hunted look. She dipped her hands, cupping the water. It was warm and tasted of minerals, but it was wet. She drank, then splashed the grit from her face. Chayton came back, his movement silent. He knelt beside her, not close, but sharing the small space. He, too, cupped the water. He drank last. As he lowered his hand, Cora noticed his palm. The inside of his left hand was a fine, pale tracery of scars, a scrim of old burns that covered the skin from his wrist to the base of his fingers. They were white and puckered, not the angry red of a new wound, but the settled, shiny mark of old, deep work. This was not from today, not from her barn. She looked away, ashamed to be caught staring. It felt like reading a letter not meant for her. She stood, brushing the mud from her torn skirt. As she did, a sound, thin and faint, drifted over the landscape. "Dong! Dong! Dong!" It was a sound that crawled along the stone, a vibration felt in the teeth more than heard with the ears. Cora froze. She knew that sound. It wasn't the Sabbath bell from the church in Pinyon Ford. It was the heavy iron militia bell in the town square, the one they rang for fires, for raids, for... "They're calling the men," she whispered. "Danner is ringing the bell. He's making his story true." The sound meant the town was angry. It meant the lie was official. The lie that savages had burned the Ashdown Ranch. The lie that would justify the peace detail and the army patrols. The lie that made her a fugitive and him a target. Chayton's face was impassive, carved from the same red stone as the cliffs. We moved north. He pulled the horse back into the wash, and they started again, this time at a steady, ground-eating walk. The sun began its long, brutal descent, painting the western sky in shades of blood and sulfur. The land changed. The narrow wash gave way to sprawling salt flats, a white, cracked pan that shimmered in the heat. "Not the flats," Cora said, her voice hoarse but firm. "There's no cover. They can see a man 5 miles off. We should go west, toward the Chert Ridge." Chayton stopped. He looked at her, and, for the first time, there was a flicker of appraisal in his eyes. "The Chert Ridge," she insisted, mapping the country aloud, needing to prove she was more than just cargo. "It's rough, but there's a spring on the north face. From there, we can cut through the high pastures to Crow Ladder Butte. Danner's men won't ride the butte at night. Too broken." He listened, his head tilted. He was patient. When she finished, he nodded, but only once. "The Chert Ridge is the first place a rancher would hide," he said quietly. "It's the first place Danner will send men. Your spring is known. They will be waiting." He pointed not west, but northwest, toward a line of low, unremarkable hills. "We stay low. We follow the draws, not the ridges. We'll cross the Sable Fork near the old crossing, where the water is low." He revised her route. Once, twice, patiently dismantling her competent plan with a superior one. He wasn't thinking of hiding. He was thinking of vanishing. Cora fell silent, the correction stinging, but she knew he was right. Her competence was for finding lost steers. His was for evading men who wanted to kill him. The mention of the Sable Fork brought the ache back, sharp and sudden. "The farm! My mother! The fork is so far! I left her with that rifle!" Her voice broke. The image of Martha, frail and terrified, holding the heavy rifle, was a knife in her ribs. Chayton kept walking, his voice flat, forcing her to match his pace. "Hawk Mesa women are near Salt Willow. They saw the smoke. They are not Danner. They will not leave a sick woman untouched. The fire was for the ranch, not for her." He paused, letting the horse pick its way over a patch of volcanic rock. He looked back at her, his expression unsoftened. "You'll see her again. Cora, if you live to—" The cold, hard truth of it silenced her. Survival first. Everything else was a luxury. Night fell fast, as it does in the high desert. The heat didn't fade. It was sucked from the earth, replaced by a sudden, penetrating cold. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. They dismounted, leading the exhausted gelding in silence. The land was silvered by a rising sliver of moon. Walking saved the horse's strength, and theirs. Their lungs, raw from smoke, burned in the cold air. A coyote yipped, sharp and lonely, and was answered by a chorus from the ridges. The sound made Cora's skin crawl. Chayton stopped, holding up a hand. He pointed east, back the way they had come. A tiny ember cloud, a faint orange smudge against the black horizon, pulsed miles away. It was too large for a single rider's campfire. "The posse?" Cora breathed. They camped at your basin," Chayton corrected. "At the smoke, drinking Danner's whiskey, celebrating." The sight of it, the proof of her home's destruction, made her feel sick. He led them on, into a deeper fold of the hills, finding shelter under a wide limestone ledge that overhung a sandy patch of ground. It smelled of dust and ancient, dry things. "We rest here," he said. He unsaddled Buck, though there was no saddle, only the blanket, and rubbed the horse down with handfuls of dry grass. Cora watched him, her body shaking, her teeth chattering. When he was done, he sat, his back against the rock, and pulled a strip of something dark from a pouch at his belt. He offered it to her. Jerked antelope. It was dry, tough as boot leather, and covered in a spice that stung her tongue. She took it, nodding her thanks. She chewed, the salt and chili making her cough. She looked at Chayton. In the faint moonlight, she saw the corner of his mouth tilt. It wasn't a smile. It was the barest suggestion of one, gone as quickly as it came. A sudden gust of wind swept under the ledge, carrying a scent that was achingly familiar, the smell of rain. Cora looked up at the sky. desperate for the dark clouds, for the release. But the stars were sharp, hard points of light. There was no rain, just the scent of it, a ghost of moisture from a storm miles away. Mocking them, a shiver, violent and deep, racked her body. It wasn't only the cold, it was the loss, the fear, the exhaustion, and the bitter, terrifying realization of her complete dependency on this man. "I don't like debts," she muttered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how I can't pay you for this." Chayton finished his jerky, chewing slowly, his gaze on the distant, pulsing ember of the posse's camp. "Then pay me by breathing tomorrow," he said. He reached for his wrist. He wore a simple rawhide knot, a thong he'd had on since she first saw him. He untied it with his teeth in his scarred hand. It was just a thin strip of oiled leather, worn smooth. He held it out to her. "What is this?" "Wear it," he said. "When we find water again, you will want to swallow. This reminds you to sip. Panic swallows. We sip." Cora looked at the simple leather thong. It was a piece of him, a piece of his knowledge, his way of living. It was a tool and a lesson. She grumbled, a low sound of protest in her throat, her pride still fighting. "I know how to drink water." But she took it, her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled as she tried to tie it around her own wrist. He watched her struggle for a moment, then reached over and, with a quick, deft movement, secured the knot for her. His fingers brushed her skin, calloused and warm. She wore it. It felt strange, a foreign weight on her wrist, a reminder of the debt she could only pay by surviving. They walked through the pre-dawn chill for another 2 hours, Chayton leading the gelding through a maze of arroyos that seemed to Cora to have no pattern, but he moved with a quiet certainty, reading the creases in the land like a map. Just as the eastern sky began to bleed from indigo to a pale, milky gray, he stopped. "We are here," he said. Cora looked around. They were in a shallow basin, a fold of dark, volcanic basalt that rose on 3 sides, creating a natural fortress. She saw nothing but rock and shadow. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw the signs of life. A wisp of smoke, thin as a thread and blue in the new light, rose from behind a jumble of boulders. It rose straight, then dispersed, a careful fire that was meant to be missed. Then she saw the structures. They weren't houses, not in the way she understood them. They were low willow domes, wickiups, their curved shapes blending so perfectly with the surrounding landscape that they seemed to have grown there. The encampment of Hawk Mesa was not built upon the land. It was woven into it. The silence was profound, broken only by the tired sigh of her horse. As the light grew stronger, a flap of hide was pushed aside on the nearest dome. A woman stepped out. Her hair was bound in 2 long, silver-streaked braids. She wore a simple buckskin dress, and her back was ramrod straight. She looked at them, her eyes dark and wary, taking in Cora's torn dress, Chayton's soot-stained face, the exhausted horse. She did not speak, but her gaze was a question. Another woman emerged, younger, and then another. They moved with a quiet purpose, their eyes missing nothing. They were the first line of defense, the watchers of the dawn. Then came the children. A small boy, no older than 5, peeked around the edge of a wickiup, his eyes wide and curious. A girl, a few years older, joined him. They stared at Cora, a creature unlike any they had seen up close. She was a ghost from another world, smelling of smoke and fear. Buck, her gelding, chose that moment to lower his head and let out a tremendous, rattling sneeze that echoed in the quiet basin. The spell of silent observation was broken. The children's hands flew to their mouths, their serious faces dissolving into suppressed giggles. The boy ducked back behind the dome, his small shoulders shaking with laughter. The tension in the air eased. Just a fraction. A horse was a horse, and a sneeze was funny. Chayton walked forward, leading the gelding. He stopped a respectful distance from the first woman who had appeared. He began to speak, and his voice was not the clipped, flat tone he had used with Cora. It was different, measured, formal. each word placed with care, like a mason setting stones in a foundation. He spoke his own tongue, a language of soft consonants and long vowels that sounded like the wind moving through rock. Cora could not understand the words, but she understood their weight. He gestured toward her, not with a point, but with an open hand. He spoke for a long time, his gaze steady on the woman. Later, he would tell her what he had said, a translation that was more poem than report. He had named her as Rainstruck, for the phantom storm that had hidden their trail, Firestolen, for the home she had lost, and finally, Under my watch, a declaration of responsibility that settled over her like a heavy blanket. When he finished, the lead woman gave a single, sharp nod. She turned and spoke to the others. A space was made. They were being allowed to enter. An elder woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, approached Cora. Her steps were slow but steady. This was the woman they called Auntie Salt Sage. She looked into Cora's eyes, a long, searching gaze that felt as though it were peeling back the layers of soot and exhaustion to see the woman beneath. Without a word, Auntie Salt Sage took a heavy wool shawl from her own shoulders. It was woven with patterns of red and black, and it smelled richly of cedar smoke. She pressed it into Cora's arms. The gesture was one of welcome, a gift of warmth against the morning chill. But in the old woman's eyes, there was a warning, too. A reminder that a gift accepted creates a bond, an obligation. Welcome and warning, folded together in the soft wool. The next hours were a blur of quiet activity, a world of rhythms Cora did not understand. She was not a guest to be waited on. She was a presence to be assessed, to earn her place, even for a day. She had to work. The world of fences, ledgers, and branding irons was gone. Here, value was measured in what your hands could do. A young woman showed her a flat, volcanic stone and a smaller, rounded one. She was given a bowl of dried mesquite beans and shown the motion a circular, grinding pressure that turned the hard beans into a coarse, sweet-smelling meal. Cora's first attempt was clumsy. She pushed too hard, cracking a bean that shot off the stone and into the dust. The young woman said nothing, simply retrieved another and demonstrated again. Cora's arms, strong from roping and hauling, quickly grew tired from the unfamiliar, repetitive motion. The fine muscles in her shoulders burned, but she kept at it, her jaw set. Later, she was shown how to bank the central fire, covering the glowing coals with a precise layer of gray ash to preserve the heat until evening. A task she had done 1,000 times with wood in an iron stove, but which felt like a sacred ritual here. Her most humbling lesson was in carrying water. A girl, perhaps 12 years old, handed her a large, hollowed-out gourd with a narrow opening. The girl filled it from a clay cistern, then walked with a fluid, rolling gait that kept the water from sloshing. When Cora tried, water slopped from the opening, soaking the front of her torn dress and running in dark streaks down her dusty legs. She failed a second time, overcorrecting and stumbling. On the third try, frustrated and embarrassed, she focused on the girl's hips, on the rhythm of her steps, and managed to walk 10 paces without spilling a drop. A small, fierce pride bloomed in her chest, and she let out a short, surprised laugh. The girl smiled back, a real smile this time. Life in the camp was a quiet symphony. A boy sat cross-legged, softly drumming on a small hide drum, his head cocked as he tested the tension of the skins. 2 little girls, who had been the first to giggle, shyly approached Cora as she was grinding the mesquite. She tried to thank them in their own language for a piece of dried fruit they offered. Using a word Chayton had taught her on their journey, she butchered the vowel. One of the girls, with a serious expression, repeated the word slowly, emphasizing the correct sound. The other girl corrected her again, their voices gentle, their following laughter much lighter and more open than it had been at dawn. Through it all, Chayton kept his distance. After ensuring his horse was tended to, he found a spot in the shade of an overhang and set to work mending a broken bridle strap from his pouch. He did not speak to her, did not direct her. He was letting the community, the women, take her measure. But Cora was intensely aware of him. When she stumbled on the uneven ground near the cistern, his head came up, his hand stilling on the leather. His glance found her, quick and assessing. Before returning to his work, she pretended not to notice, her neck flushing with heat. He was watching, always watching. Toward midday, Auntie Salt Sage approached her again. The old woman carried 2 clay bowls. She handed one to Cora. It was filled with a thick, dark stew that smelled of rabbit, wild onions, and a sharp, unfamiliar herb. "Truth travels slower than lies," the old woman said, her English accented but clear. "So eat." Cora was too exhausted to be hungry, but she took a spoonful. The stew was hot and potent, the sharp herb cutting through the rich flavor in a way that seemed to unclog the sorrow and fear that had been choking her. She ate, feeling the warmth spread through her limbs, a small anchor in a world that had come loose from its moorings. The quiet of the camp was broken in the late afternoon. A young man, not much more than a boy, rode in on a sweat-lathered pony. He slid from the horse's back before it had fully stopped and spoke in low, urgent tones to the elders who had gathered. Chayton left his mending and joined the group. Cora watched from a distance, her heart beginning to pound again. News from the outside world could not be good. After a few minutes, Chayton came over to her. His face was grim. "The militia bell you heard," he said. "Danner used it. Pinion Fort has deputized 11 men, farm hands and saloon loafers. He calls it a peace detail. A witness saw Danner's wagon leaving the general store. He bought ammunition for all of them. 11 new guns, paid for by Danner, looking for a reason to be used. And she was the reason." The elder council convened. It was not a formal meeting in a closed room. The 7 elders, men and women including Auntie Salt Sage, simply sat in a circle near the central fire pit. There was no shouting, no debate. One would speak, and then a long silence would follow as the others considered the words. Decisions took root in those silences. Cora understood that they were deciding her fate. She was a danger to them, a spark that could bring Danner's fire to their hidden home. The council lasted until the sun touched the western ridge. Finally, one of the old men rose and spoke a few final words. The council was over. Chayton came to her. The verdict was written on his face before he spoke. "You cannot stay as you are," he said. "An outsider without bonds is a risk. Survival needs clean lines. They have decided you may have shelter here only if you are bound to the household that guards you." Cora bristled, her pride rearing up. "Bound like property?" "No," he said, his voice sharp. "Like family, like a responsibility that is known and declared. Someone must be accountable for you, for your safety, and for the safety you might risk for others." Before she could protest further, he said, "I will claim that duty." A knot of anger and confusion tightened in Cora's chest. To be claimed, to be a duty, it was an insult to her independence, an independence she had fought for every day on the ranch. Then she caught the looks from some of the younger men who had been watching the council from a distance. One in particular, a hot-blooded youth named Teller Knox, stared at her with an unsettling intensity. It was not a look of welcome. It was a look that was measuring her worth, calculating the trouble she brought versus the bounty Danner would surely post for her return, dead or alive. She understood. Chayton's claim was not an act of possession. It was a shield. That night, under a sliver of a new moon, the bond was made. It was nothing like a wedding. There was no lace, no minister, no promises of love or forever. Auntie Salt Sage brought a single clay bowl filled with fresh water. She held it out, and the other elders placed their hands on it for a moment. Then she gave it to Chayton. He and Cora stood facing each other in the cool night air. The rest of the camp watched from a respectful distance. He held the bowl toward her. "I offer shelter," he said, his voice clear and formal in the silence. She placed her hands on the bowl, her fingers touching his. The water was cool. "I accept this shelter," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He then drank from the bowl and passed it to her. She drank as well, The water tasted of clay and night. "I will be a witness to your truth," she said, speaking the words Auntie Salt Sage had given her. It was a promise to not be a silent burden, but to see and remember. "Your truth will have a home here," he answered, completing the vow. That was all. 2 sentences about shelter and witness, a bond of necessity forged over a bowl of water. The steam from their breath mingled in the cold night air and then vanished. It was done. She was bound to his household, bound to him. The bond, spoken over water, settled a strange quiet in Cora's heart. It was not a quiet of peace, but of purpose. The wild, frantic terror of the last day had been given a shape, a direction. She was no longer just fleeing. She was moving towards something, under a protection she had accepted. That afternoon, Chayton did not rest. He went to a dense thicket of reeds growing near the basin's only spring. With a small, sharp flint knife, he began to cut. He worked with a steady, rhythmic grace, his movements practiced and sure. He was not just harvesting, he was choosing each reed for its strength and length. He built the shelter beside Auntie Salt Sage's wickiup. The location was a statement in itself under the elder's eye, a place of sanction and respectability. It was not a large structure, barely big enough for 2 people to lie down. He wove the reeds together, lashing them to a frame of bent willow, creating a small, tight dome that was surprisingly sturdy. It looked like a basket turned upside down, a temporary nest against the elements. When it was finished, Cora looked inside. The interior was Spartan, stripped to the barest necessities of survival. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. In one corner sat a clay jug of fresh water and a single, battered tin cup. Spread on the ground was one thick, woven blanket. One. The sight of it made her breath catch. The vow had been about shelter and witness, a practical arrangement. The single blanket felt different. It spoke of a closeness that the formal words had not. As dusk settled, painting the basalt cliffs in shades of violet and deep orange, the camp grew quiet. The smell of cooking fires and cedar smoke filled the air. After a silent meal shared with Auntie Salt Sage, the time came. Chayton gestured toward the small reed shelter. "The air grows cold," he said. Cora walked to the entrance, a simple flap of hide. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the edge. To step inside felt like a new kind of surrender, one more profound than taking his hand to flee the fire. She was an Ashdown. She had run her own ranch, made her own decisions. She did not take shelter easily. Chayton stood a few feet away, watching her, his face impossible to read in the deepening twilight. He saw her hesitation, the rigid line of her shoulders. He misunderstood its depth, but he respected its presence. "I will sleep outside," he offered, his voice low and even. "By the fire with the other men, I will not steal your breath." The phrase hung in the air between them. "I won't steal your breath." It was more than just an offer of space. It was a promise not to crowd her, not to presume upon the vow or the single blanket. It was a gesture of profound respect, given freely when he had every right, by the council's decree, to claim his place beside her. The offer loosened something tight and fearful in her chest. He was not Danner. He was not a man who took, he was a man who gave her a choice. Even now, she surprised herself with her own voice, the words coming out before she had fully formed them in her mind. "Stay," she said, the words soft but clear in the quiet air. She looked from the dark, open land to the small, enclosed space. I think I sleep better when the thunder has a name." A long moment passed. She could not see his expression clearly, but she saw him give a single, deliberate nod. He accepted her reason without question. Understanding the thunder she spoke of was more than just the weather. He followed her inside. The space was so small that the scent of his smoke, leather, and the clean, dusty smell of the desert filled it immediately. He did not move to the blanket. Instead, he sat with his back against the curved reed wall, a clear arm's length away. Giving her the space to bed down first, she lay down, her body stiff and awkward, pulling one edge of the thick blanket over herself. He then lay down on the opposite side, taking the other edge. a wide strip of bare earth between them. For a long time, they lay in silence, two strangers bound by fire and a vow, listening to the quiet sounds of the sleeping camp. Then, the rain began. It did not start with a storm, but with a whisper, a soft patter on the reed roof, a steady, hushing sound that enclosed them further. It was the rain that had been promised by the scent on the wind the night before. Arriving at last, the temperature inside the tiny shelter dropped. The wind, finding the small seams in the weaving, breathed a cold draft over the floor. Cora shivered, pulling the blanket tighter. The sound of her teeth chattering was loud in the quiet space. Without a word, Chayton shifted, moving from the far edge of the shelter toward the center. Toward her, the strip of earth between them disappeared. He did not touch her, but his warmth was a palpable presence beside her. They shared the same blanket now, not just its edges. Their shoulders were still apart, a careful inch of space between them. But the cold wind no longer flowed through the gap. A flicker of lightning, silent and distant, illuminated the interior of the shelter for a split second, casting their faces in stark, momentary relief. Cora's hand, lying by her side, began to shake. It wasn't the cold. The flash was too much like the muzzle flash from Silas Danner's carbine. The memory was a physical thing, a tremor that started in her fingers and threatened to consume her. Chayton's voice came out of the darkness, low and calm, a stone settling in a deep pool. "Count," he said, between the light and the sound. Another flicker of lightning, brighter this time. Cora squeezed her eyes shut. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Seconds later, a low, rumbling growl of thunder rolled across the basin. "1, 2, 3, she whispered, her voice trembling. "Slower," he murmured. "Count your breaths." Another flash. She inhaled, held it. 1. She exhaled. 2. She inhaled again. 3. The thunder came, a little closer this time. Her pulse, which had been racing, began to slow, tethered to the rhythm of her own breathing, to the simple, grounding task he had given her. She focused on the sound of the rain, a steady, gentle drumming. She focused on the warmth radiating from the man beside her, a solid, living presence in the dark. The shaking in her hand subsided. She turned her head on the bundled sack that served as her pillow. In the faint, ambient glow from Auntie Salt Saj's banked hearth fire, she could just make out the shape of his face. His eyes were open, watching her. The air in the small space grew thick, charged with something other than the storm. The practicalities of survival, the formalities of their vow, all fell away, leaving only the profound, elemental truth of their situation, a man and a woman, alone together, shielded from a world that wanted them dead. The invitation was not spoken. It was in the way her breathing softened, in the way she did not turn away from his gaze. It was in the slow, deliberate way he shifted his weight, turning slightly toward her. He moved with an unhurried grace, giving her every chance to retreat, to turn her head, to break the spell. She did not. He leaned closer, and his whisper was as soft as the rain on the roof. "Cora." Her name, on his lips, was not the harsh command she had heard at the wash, nor the formal title from their vow. It was something else entirely, a question, a recognition. Their first kiss was as quiet and gentle as the rain. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation, but of discovery, a soft press of lips, unhurried, a shared moment of warmth in the cold night. There was no grabbing, no secrecy, no hungry claiming. It was a question asked and answered. It was a taste of cedar smoke and desert rain, a moment of profound and unexpected solace. He was the one who broke it, pulling back slowly, his breath warm against her cheek. The space between them hummed with the unspoken. The heat was a living thing, more powerful than the banked fire outside, but it was tempered by something else, something stronger. "Sleep," he whispered, his voice slightly rough. "Tomorrow we carry more than ourselves." The words were a gentle anchor, pulling them back to the reality of their situation. His respect was as palpable as the heat that shimmered between them. He was reminding them both of the stakes, of the burdens they shared. It was the most profound act of care he could have shown her. He settled back onto his side of the blanket, not moving away, but re-establishing a boundary of honor. Cora closed her eyes, the feeling of his lips still warm on hers. For the first time since the fire, she felt a flicker not of hope, but of something deeper resilience. She was not alone in the thunder. She slept. In the morning, the rain had stopped. A cool, clean light filtered through the reeds. Cora woke first. Chayton was asleep, his face turned toward her. In sleep, the harsh, watchful lines of his face were softened. He looked younger. He had thrown an arm out from under the blanket, and she could see the fine, white tracery of the burn scars on his hand in the morning light. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb him. She went to the jug and poured water into the tin cup. The rawhide thong he had given her had come loose in the night. She picked it up from the floor. For a moment, she just held it, the leather smooth and warm from her own skin. Then, with a deliberate motion, she tied it back around her wrist, knotting it securely. She turned and found him awake. He was watching her, his eyes following the movement of her hands as she secured the knot. A complex emotion flickered in his face, gratitude, relief, and something else. A deep and quiet want that was for more than just a woman. It was a want for the partnership her simple gesture affirmed. They moved through the morning in a new kind of silence, one of comfort, not awkwardness. Later, as they shared a meal of mesquite cakes, they traded words. He was trying to perfect his English, a language he knew for trade, but not for nuance. "Thank you," he said, accepting a cake from her. "Thank," she corrected gently, touching her tongue to her top teeth to show him the sound. "Thank," he tried again, the sound clumsy at first, then clearer. "Thank you," she smiled, a real, unguarded smile. She, in turn, asked him for a word in his own language. "How do you say, enough?" He taught her the word. Enough, a soft, breathy sound. Later that day, as he was stubbornly trying to splint a cracked axe handle that was clearly beyond repair, she walked over to him. He was scowling at the wood, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. She placed a hand gently on his arm. "Enough," she said softly. "Enough." He stopped, looking from the broken handle to her face. A slow, genuine smile spread across his lips, transforming his usually stoic features. He set the handle aside. Their intimacy grew in these small, quiet moments. Standing by the fire, he would reach out and brush a stray piece of ash from her hair. She, in turn, would mend a small tear in his shirt, her fingers brushing against his skin. Once, as she looked at the map of old burns on his hand, she gently laid her own palm against his, her fingers tracing the work-scarred lines, a silent question and a statement of shared hardship. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and held hers for a long moment, a shared breath passing between them. The world outside the shelter was a blur of rain beating on the woven reeds, of smoke rising from the hearth, of the quiet, purposeful life of the camp. But inside their small, shared space, a new world was being built. One quiet touch, one shared word at a time. Cora woke before dawn on the third day. The air was cold. Chayton was still asleep, a deep and exhausted sleep. He had shifted in the night, and one shoulder was uncovered, exposed to the chill. She moved carefully, her heart doing a slow, strange turn in her chest. She reached over and gently pulled the thick wool blanket higher, tucking it securely around his shoulder. It was a small, simple gesture of care, of tenderness. But in the silent, pre-dawn light of the shelter, it felt as loud as a declaration. It was an answer to his respect, a promise of her own. It was the thing that neither of them would risk saying aloud. Not yet. But the gesture set it for them. The days at Hawk Mesa settled into a rhythm, one dictated by the sun, the needs of the animals, and the quiet, constant work of the community. Cora's life, once measured by fence lines and cattle counts, was now measured by the tasks her hands could learn. She was a quick study, driven by a need to not be a burden, to pay her way in something other than the trouble she had brought. Her mornings began with hauling willow. She and the younger women would walk to the spring, cutting the supple, green branches and lashing them into heavy bundles. Her ranch-calloused hands were strong, but this was different work, taxing her muscles in new ways. She learned to braid horsehair into tight, strong ropes, her fingers fumbling at first with the intricate patterns, so different from the simple lariat knot. The women taught her wordlessly, their hands guiding hers, a silent, patient instruction that she found more comforting than any words of encouragement. One afternoon, Auntie Salt Sudge motioned her over to a small, nervous foal that was refusing to nurse, its sides pinched with colic. The old woman was humming a low, monotonous chant, her hands rubbing the foal's belly. "He misses his mother," Auntie Salt Sudge said, not looking up. "She was taken by the cough. This one has a cold belly and a sad heart." Cora watched the old woman's practiced hands. "My mother," Cora said, her voice soft. "She used to sing a song for that, an old song from her mother." Auntie Salt Sage nodded. "A song is good medicine. Sing it." Hesitantly, Cora knelt in the dust beside the foal. She began to sing, the words of a half-forgotten lullaby from a different world, a song of green meadows and quiet streams. Her voice was untrained, a little rough from the smoke and the dry air, but it was steady. The foal's ears twitched. Auntie Salt Sage closed her eyes, her hands still rubbing, and matched Cora's tune with a low, throaty hum. They sat there, two women from two worlds, trading melodies to coax a small, pained life. After a long time, the foal let out a soft sigh and nudged against its foster mare. Cora found a strange peace in the work, but she was always aware of Chayton. He was a constant, quiet presence, mending tack, reinforcing the wickiups against the wind, or simply watching the ridgeline. She saw his unique skill one afternoon with a new horse, a skittish dun gelding a scout had brought in, his eyes rolling white with fear, a rope burn on his neck. The younger men, including Teller Knox, were trying to muscle him into the rope corral, shouting and waving their arms, only making the horse more frantic. Chayton walked into the cloud of dust. He didn't carry a rope. He just stood, his body relaxed, not looking directly at the horse. He let the dun circle him, snorting. Then, Chayton made a sound. It was a soft, sharp click, high in his palate, followed by a low, vibrating hum deep in his throat. It was not a human sound, but it was not quite an animal one, either. It was a sound of absolute calm. The dun's ears swiveled, locking onto him. Chayton clicked again, and hummed. He took one slow step. The horse trembled but held its ground. Chayton talked horse for 10 minutes, a conversation of clicks, hums, and slow, non-threatening movements, until he was standing at the dun's shoulder, his hand resting on its neck. The horse let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned into his touch. Cora watched, fascinated. Later, when the dun was calmer, she approached it. "How did you do that?" she asked Chayton, who was checking the horse's hoof. He shrugged. "You just listen to what he's afraid of, and you tell him you're not that." Cora, confident in her own way with horses, tried to mimic the sound. She produced a clumsy, wet click and a noise that sounded more like a grumble. The dun looked at her, confused, but then, perhaps smelling the lingering scent of the foal on her, he stretched his neck and nudged her hand, accepting her anyway. Chayton watched, and the corner of his mouth tilted in that almost smile. "He thinks you are a very strange horse," Chayton said. Their easy, quiet partnership grew. They were tasked with building a new smoke rack for drying meat. Chayton set the frame, and Cora gathered the flat stones for the base. She built the small, contained fire pit, but her mind was elsewhere, worrying about her mother, about Danner. The kindling was too dry, her hand too generous with the tinder. A sudden gust of wind caught a spark, and the dry grass beside the rack flared up, licking at the new willow frame. "Ka!" she yelped. beating the flames with her shawl. Chayton moved in, not with panic, but with efficiency, kicking dirt onto the flames and smothering them with a wet hide. In seconds, the fire was out, leaving only a patch of blackened earth and a singed rack. Cora stood there, coughing, her face flushed with embarrassment. Chayton looked at the scorched willow, then at her, his expression completely deadpan. "Fire follows you. Cora Ashdown." She glared at him, then saw the glint in his eye. A small laugh, rusty and surprised, escaped her. "Then you had best keep me near water. Chayton Redbird." "That is the plan," he said, his voice serious, but the warmth in his eyes told her he was sharing the joke. The humor, however, was a thin blanket over a bed of coals. The threat was always present. It returned a few days later, riding in with 2 scouts who had gone south, near Pinyon Ford. They spoke to the elders, their voices low and urgent. Chayton translated for Cora later, his face grim. "Danner is not waiting." He petitioned the territorial governor for a settler protection post. He calls it Camp Laurel. The wagons that arrived were not carrying soldiers' blankets. They were carrying surveying tools and eviction notices. The map says safety. The wagons say Danner is clearing the basin, and now he has the law's signature to do it. The news hit Cora like a physical blow. Evictions? That means he's not just after me. He's after everyone. Anyone who didn't sell. Her mind flew to her mother. If they're clearing the basin, what about my mother? The old terror, the one she had managed to bank like a fire, flared anew. She turned away, walking to the edge of the camp, her hands twisting the rawhide thong at her wrist. He had no answer for her, or... He found her an hour later, sitting on a basalt boulder, staring south toward a home that no longer existed. He sat near her, not touching, just a solid presence. "More news," he said. She tensed, bracing herself. "A different scout," he said, speaking slowly. "He trades with the blacksmith in Pinyon Ford. He asked about Martha Ashdown." Cora's head snapped up. "She is not at the ranch. The fire? When the farmhouse roof caught? She fired the rifle, twice, like you said." Cora's eyes filled. A hot, painful sting. "She heard me?" "She did. The shots were heard by a neighbor coming to see the smoke. He got her out before the house fell in. He took her to town. She is at the Pinyon Ford clinic." "The clinic?" Cora whispered. "Danner's men. Sheriff Harmon. She is tended by Sister Amelie," Chayton said, a note of respect in his voice. "The sister is a good woman. The sheriff came, asking questions. Sister Amelie told him Martha Ashdown was too sick from smoke to speak, and that God's house was not a jail. She is a nun who disobeys the sheriff when it matters. Your mother is alive. She is safe." Cora broke. The relief was too sudden, too immense. She covered her face with her hands and wept. Deep, silent sobs that shook her entire body. She wept for her mother's safety, for the loss of the barn, for the terror of the fire, and for the simple, profound fact that her mother had heard her and fired the rifle. Chayton did not move to comfort her. He simply sat, a silent witness, letting her grief run its course. When her sobs finally quieted, he reached into the pouch at his belt. He held something out to her on his scarred palm. It was a stone, a simple, dark river stone, worn perfectly smooth. It was shaped, by years in the water, into a near-perfect heart. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes clouded with confusion. "For when your chest feels heavy," he said, his voice rough. "So you remember it is not empty. It is just full of stone, and stone can be carried." She couldn't answer. Her throat was too thick. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and took the stone from his hand. It was cool and solid, a heavy, tangible weight. She closed her fist around it, the smooth edges pressing into her palm. A piece of the river, a piece of the land, a piece of his quiet strength. She slipped it deep into the pocket of her skirt, where it rested against her thigh. A secret anchor. That night, she felt strong enough to join the evening circle. The camp gathered around the main fire, the air filled with the sharp, clean scent of burning cedar. An elder began a song, his voice a low chant, and the others joined in. It was not a song of joy, but of forbearance, a song about the long memory of the stone, the patience of the river, and the certainty that winter always ends. Cora found herself humming the refrain under her breath, the melody seeping into her bones. She felt a pair of eyes on her. She looked up and met the gaze of Teller Knox, the hot-headed youth. He was sitting across the fire, and his look was not one of welcome. It was a sneer, a look of open resentment. He muttered something to the man beside him, and the man looked at Cora and laughed. The truce was over. She was the outsider, the white woman who had brought Danner's heat down on them. Before Cora could react, Chayton, who had been sitting beside her, rose. He didn't rise quickly, or with anger. He simply stood up, a tall, solid shadow in the firelight. He walked around the circle, his steps silent, and stood directly in front of Teller Knox. He carried no blade, no weapon. He did not speak. He just stood there, looking down at the younger man. It was not a threat. It was a simple, undeniable statement. She is under my watch. Teller Knox's sneer faltered. He tried to hold Chayton's gaze, his pride warring with his fear. He looked away first, to his friend, who was suddenly fascinated by the fire. He looked to the elders. Auntie Salt Sage was watching, her face like carved wood. Her eyes met Teller's, and she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was enough. The rebuke was public, silent, and absolute. Teller Knox flushed a dark red. He stood up abruptly and stalked away from the fire, disappearing into the darkness. Chayton stood for a moment longer, then returned to his place beside Cora. The singing resumed as if nothing had happened. Later, Cora found an old copy of the Pinion Clarion left behind by a trader, folded and used to wrap dried herbs. She smoothed it out, her eyes scanning the familiar print. It was full of stories of Danner's generosity, of army patrols keeping the peace, and a small column about renegade raids. She brought it to Auntie Salt Sage. "I used to believe these," Cora admitted, her voice low with shame. "When I was a girl, I believed every raid story they printed." Auntie Salt Sage tapped the newspaper with a gnarled finger. "Ink is a horse, child," the old woman said, her voice dry as dust. "You just have to see who holds the reins. Danner rides this one hard." The words settled on Cora. Another layer of her old world stripped away. The truth wasn't just unspoken, it was actively unwritten, replaced by a lie on a printed page. That night, they took the watch together on the high ridge above the camp. The air was cold and clear, the sky a vast, glittering spread of stars. They sat side by side, sharing a blanket, their rifles resting across their laps. Cora looked up, tracing a familiar pattern. "My father called that the dipper," she said. "He said it was the drinking gourd God used to scoop the water from the sky." Chayton was silent for a moment, following her gaze. "We call it the bear," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He is running from the hunters. See the 3 stars in the handle. They are the hunters who chase him all winter. But they never catch him. He always finds his den." Cora looked again, and the shape shifted. She saw it, a bear, running, and the hunters in pursuit. "Both," she whispered, "a drinking gourd and a bear. Both are true." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the same stars with different eyes, the two truths existing together in the vast, quiet dark. They didn't sleep much on those nights, and it wasn't only the danger. It was the heavy, unspoken thing in the air between them, the shared breath under a blanket, the weight of the heartstone in her pocket, and the growing certainty that they were tied by something far stronger than a simple vow spoken over water. The fragile peace of the camp, woven from shared work and quiet humor, was torn apart just after midday. A runner, a Hawk Mesa youth named Kills His Enemy, stumbled into the basin, his pony foam-flecked and trembling, its sides heaving. The runner himself was sweat-white, his face a mask of dust and horror, his eyes wide and vacant. He slid from the pony's back and fell to his knees, gasping for air. The camp went utterly silent. Women stopped grinding meal. Children froze in their games. And the men who were mending tack dropped their tools. Chayton was at the runner's side in an instant, helping him up, giving him a dipper of water. The youth drank, and the water spilled from the corners of his mouth. He tried to speak, his voice a raw croak. He pointed south, back the way he had come. "Willow Notch." He choked. "It's gone. Burned." A collective gasp, a sharp intake of breath, was the only sound. Willow Notch was not a hidden camp like this one. It was a peaceful, known encampment, home to a dozen families who traded with the settlers, a place of elders and children. "Who?" an elder asked, his voice a low command. "Volunteers," the runner whispered, the word laced with bitter irony. They wore blue, army coats, but they were not soldiers. They were Danner's men. They came at dawn. They set the fires first. Then, he could not finish. He looked at Chayton, his gaze desperate, and began to speak in their own tongue, the words falling from his lips like a torrent of poisoned stones. It was a litany, a roll call of the dead. The names ran like beads off a broken string. An old man who told stories, a woman known for her medicines, a young couple, Chayton's own cousin, a man he had hunted with 2 moons ago. And then the runner's voice broke. He spoke of Chayton's cousin's wickiup, and of the cradle board inside. He spoke of finding it later, outside, broken and empty. The horror of the empty cradle, the unspoken implication of a life simply erased, was a sickness that spread through the crowd. This was not a battle. It was a purge. Grief is not always a wail. Sometimes it is a quiet, a void that crushes the ribs, a sudden, brutal absence of air. This was that grief. Chayton did not shout. He did not weep. He simply stood, his back to Cora, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his shoulders rigid. He looked as if he had been turned to stone, a man hollowed out by a single, terrible breath. For Cora, the news was a moral earthquake. The ground beneath her, the very world she thought she knew, split open. A sickening, toxic shame flooded her, hot and acidic. This was not war. This was her people, her race, committing an atrocity for what? Then the fury came, braiding tight with the shame, giving it a hard, sharp edge. She knew exactly why. "Proof," she whispered, her voice shaking. Chayton turned, his face a mask she did not recognize. It was stripped of all warmth, all the quiet humor and tenderness she had come to know. All that was left was a cold, pure anger. "What?" he said, his voice flat. "It's Danner," she said, louder, her voice ringing with a terrible certainty that cut through the camp's stunned silence. "It's his proof. He burned my ranch to get the town to ring the militia bell. He needed a savage attack to justify his peace detail and bring in the army. He created the lie. And now he's created the bodies to make the lie true. He's clearing the land. He's clearing it of anyone who won't sell, and he's using the law to do it." She saw it all. A map of theft and fire. He wasn't just a cattle baron. He was a liar in chief. A man who would murder families, women, and children to make his paperwork legal, to clear the land titles he coveted. The moral weight of it, the complicity of her own world, settled on her, heavy as the heartstone in her pocket. The elder council convened immediately, but the long, patient silences of their last meeting were gone. This time the council was split, the grief and rage a sharp, divisive wedge. An old, cautious elder named Stone Talker argued for survival. "Danner has the army's coats. He has the law's ink. He has a thirst that water will not quench. We cannot fight this. We must go north, to the high plains. We must take the children and the seed corn and flee. We must live. To stay is to die." Then Teller Knox, his face dark with a young man's fury, jumped to his feet. "Flee," he spat. "We flee, and he will say we are guilty. We flee, and he will take this too. My aunt was at Willow Notch. No, we will not run." He pointed south. "Danner sends a supply wagon from Pinion Ford to his new Camp Laurel in 2 days. We know the route. We ambush it. We take the guns. We burn the wagons. We send him a message in a language he understands. Blood! Blood for blood! A chorus of approval rose from the younger men. The camp was balanced on a knife edge, ready to plunge into a war they could not win, a war that would only prove Danner's lie. Cora, her entire body shaking, her heart hammering, stepped into the circle. She had no right. She was the outsider, the white woman, the source of the trouble. But she was bound by her vow, and she held Chayton's stone in her pocket. "No," she said, her voice trembling but carrying in the sudden, shocked silence. Teller Knox whirled on her. "You have no voice here. Firebringer." "She is under my watch," Chayton said, his voice a low growl. He had not moved, but his words were a wall. "She will speak." Cora looked at the elders, at Auntie Salt Sage, at the furious face of Teller Knox. "He's right," she said, looking at Teller. "You can't flee. He will call you guilty. But you can't fight. Not like that. You ambush that wagon, and you give Danner exactly what he wants. You will be renegades. You will be savages. He will have the justification to hunt every last one of you, and the town, the whole territory. We'll thank him for it." She turned to the council. "Blood won't stop him. It will only make his lie stronger. His real power isn't in his guns. It's in his office. It's in his brand books, and his parcel ledgers, and his receipts." She took a deep breath. "He's a thief, not a warrior. He's using ink to steal this land, so we must use his own ink against him. We have to catch the lie in daylight. We have to show the town, the good people in Pinyon Ford, the ones who believe his newspaper, what he is. We have to make them choose." A new silence fell. This was a third path. Not flight, not a hopeless battle, but a different kind of war. "What do you mean?" Auntie Salt Sage asked, her dark eyes sharp. "We steal his truth," Cora said. "We go to Pinyon Ford. We get into his land office. We take the books, the parcel ledgers that show who he bought land from, and when, the brand books, the receipts for the lamp oil he bought before my fire, the payments to his volunteers, the proof that he torched settler claims and native camps to buy them for pennies, or to have the army declare the land abandoned. We take his lies and we nail them to the courthouse door." The plan was insane. It was a ride into the lion's mouth, but it was the only way. The elders were silent, seeing the terrible, beautiful logic of it. "I will go," Chayton said. It was not an offer, it was a statement. His grief had cooled, hardened into a new, sharp-edged purpose. "No," Cora said, stepping to his side. I know the town. I know his office. I know what a ledger looks like. You will not go alone," he said. And that was the end of the debate. That night, as the camp prepared in a grim, quiet hum of activity, Chayton and Cora walked to the edge of the basin, to the small, dry wash where the river stone he had given her might have once rested. The air was thick and heavy, the sky to the west a bruised, sickly purple. Thunderheads, which had been threatening for days, were now massing on the horizon, a visible promise of the storm to come. Chayton bent and picked up a piece of flat, river-worn slate. He held it in his scarred palm, his thumb tracing its edge. His voice was raw, stripped of everything but the grief that now fueled him. He spoke a private oath, his words for her and the coming storm alone. "They burned the cradle. They ended my blood. So I will we end his fires. Cora, or we die trying." The words were a death pact, a vow of pure revenge. Cora looked at his face, at the terrible, empty resolve there, and she knew it was the wrong path. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her fingers covering the stone. The heart-shaped rock in her pocket felt heavy, a counterweight to the stone of death in his hand. "No," she said, her voice fierce, commanding. "You will not die trying. That is his victory. That is what he wants. Another Dead Hawk Mesa man to prove his point." She tightened her grip. "We live, then we end them. Living is the first revenge. Chayton, living and telling the truth. We will live." He looked at her, his gaze shifting from the dark horizon to her face. He saw not a frightened settler, but a woman forged in the same fire that had nearly consumed him. He saw a partner. He let the piece of slate fall from his hand, and it clattered softly in the dust. The tension, the grief, the shared purpose, the charged, electric air of the coming storm. It all became too much to hold. He turned to her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing the soot stains that were still, faintly, on her skin. It was not a gentle kiss. The first one, in the shelter, had been a question. This was an answer. It was fierce, steady, and had the bitter taste of ash and ozone. It was a kiss of equals, of partners, a binding of two people in the face of a shared, deadly purpose. It was not born of fear, or of passion, but of the cold, hard certainty that tomorrow promised no gentle thing. It was a promise to live, sealed under a sky that was about to break. They broke apart, not in softness, but with a sharp, shared breath. They had work to do. As they returned to the center of the camp, where two horses were being prepared with muffled hooves, Auntie Salt Saj met them. She carried a small clay bowl, not of water, but of fine gray ash from the central hearth, the one Cora had learned to bank. The old woman dipped her thumb into the ash. She took Cora's left arm, pushing back the sleeve of her borrowed dress, and drew a single, straight, deliberate line from her elbow to her wrist. The ash was cool, gritty. Then she did the same for Chayton, for truth to stick, the old woman murmured, her voice a low prayer. For your eyes to see clear and your hands to hold fast, do not let the lie of his world stick to you. Bring the truth home. They mounted. The camp did not cheer. They watched in a terrible, hopeful silence. Cora and Chayton turned the horses, not north to escape, but south toward Pinyon Ford. They rode out into the darkness, two small figures against a vast, hostile land. In the lower draws, they could see the distant, winking fires of night riders patrolling the basin, Danner's men hunting for survivors of Willow Notch, and in the western sky, the storm finally broke its silence. Sheet lightning, stark and white, began to spiderweb across the black, towering clouds, illuminating the world in brief, silent flashes. A war in heaven that was about to begin on earth. The high, clear sound of the market bell was a lie. It rang over Pinyon Ford, a promise of commerce, of order, of fresh-baked bread and newly shod horses. But for Cora and Chayton, it was a starting pistol. They slipped into the town not as a pair, but as two separate streams of purpose, swallowed instantly by the bustle. They had left the horses in a tamarisk grove north of the creek, their hooves still muffled, and walked the last mile. Now, they were just a woman in a borrowed shawl, her face kept low, and a Hawk Mesa man in worn denims, unremarkable among the ranchers, traders, and prospectors who thronged the dusty Main Street. The ash line on Cora's forearm, hidden beneath her sleeve, felt like it was burning. Danner's land title office was exactly as she remembered it, a false front of new pine, its windows proclaiming Progress Property in bold gold leaf. It was a respectable-looking building, designed to make theft look like a legal transaction. They entered. The air inside was still, smelling of stale cigar smoke, ink, and the dry, papery scent of ledgers. A single, harried-looking clerk, a young man named Silas, was behind the high counter, a green visor shading his eyes. He didn't look up immediately, his pen scratching furiously on a bill of sale. Chayton did not stop. He moved past the counter as if heading for a public water pump in the back, his steps silent on the floorboards. He was a ghost, his presence so natural and unassuming that the clerk didn't even register him passing. Cora stepped up to the counter, her heart a cold, heavy hammer against her ribs. She arranged her face into a mask of polite, anxious inquiry. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little too high, a perfect imitation of a nervous settler. The clerk, Silas, looked up, annoyed. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you," Cora said, twisting a fold of her shawl. "It's about our property taxes. My husband, well, He's not good with figures, and we received a notice. She was inventing it as she went, pulling from a well of memories of her father fretting over the same counter. It's the parcel at Salt Willow Basin, the Ashdown claim. She said her own name. It was a calculated risk. The clerk, too young to have known her well, would only see the name on a map. Ashdown. Silas frowned, running a finger down a list. Salt Willow. Oh, ma'am, that claim's in arrears. It's under legal review. Review? Cora widened her eyes. But we paid. I think we paid. Could you possibly check the main ledger, my husband insisted. The clerk sighed, a sound of pure bureaucratic suffering. The main tax ledgers are in the back. It will take a moment. Oh, thank you, Cora breathed, relief flooding her. You're so very kind. The clerk huffed and disappeared through the door behind him, the one Chayton had passed seconds before. The front office was empty. Cora held her breath. She could hear the faint sound of the clerk dragging a heavy book from a shelf, a muffled curse. Then another sound, one that didn't belong. Scree. It was the unmistakable protesting creak of a single, loose floorboard from the hallway behind the clerk's office. Chayton, a new voice, hard and official, cut through the air from the back room. Silas, who are you talking to out there? Just a woman about the Ashdown tax claim? Sheriff, the clerk called back, his voice muffled. Ashdown. The voice was closer now. Heavy, booted steps. Sheriff Lyle Harmon rounded the counter, his hand already on his pistol. He wasn't wearing his badge. He was wearing Ezekiel Danner's confidence. His eyes, dull and disinterested, swept over Cora, and he recognized her. The disinterest vanished, replaced by a jolt of pure, predatory shock. His face went pale, then red. You, he breathed. It's her. It's the Ashdown woman. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his whistle from his shirt and blew a piercing, three-blast alarm. Caesar! In the land office, it's Ashdown! Cora didn't wait. She grabbed the heavy inkwell from the counter and hurled it at his face. He ducked, and the ink exploded against the wall. A black spray of Danner's truth. From the back, a crash. Chayton. The street outside erupted. The lazy market bustle vanished, replaced by the sound of running boots. The shing-shack of rifles being chambered. Shouts. What is it? It's her. Danner's men to the office. Cora ran, not for the front door, but for the side wall, toward a small, grimy window marked pantry. Chayton burst from the back room, not empty-handed. Tucked under his arm were two thick, leather-bound volumes, the parcel transfer journal and the purchase ledger. Window, he yelled. He was there a half-second before her. He didn't try the latch. He drove his elbow through the glass and the cheap wood frame, a shower of splinters and grit. He bundled the ledgers, wrapped them in his own shirt, and shoved them through the jagged opening, dropping them into the alley outside. Go, he ordered, shoving her toward the hole. She scrambled through, her dress tearing on a shard of glass, and landed hard in the filthy alley. The books were there, safe. Chayton was right behind her, moving like a cat, his hands already grabbing the ledgers. A bullet slapped the brick wall above her head, whining as it ricocheted. A deputy was at the mouth of the alley, leveling his rifle. There, don't let him reach the horses. Chayton grabbed her hand, hauling her to her feet. Sprint, for the crossing, now! They ran. They burst from the alley onto the side street, a blur of motion. Their horses, Buck and the skittish Dunn, were where they'd left them, tethered in the tamarisk grove. They didn't have time for saddles, for bridles. Chayton leaped onto the Dunn's back, hauling the ledgers with him. Cora grabbed Buck's mane, her foot finding a hold on the picket pin, and swung herself onto the gelding's bare back, her torn skirt hiking up to her thighs. Yeah! They exploded from the grove, kicking up a cloud of dust and dry leaves. Stop them! The shout came from behind, furious and full of rage. Ezekiel Danner himself, on his big black stallion, was riding out from the livery, his face a mask of fury. He saw them. He raised his arm, pointing. Sable Fork, they're running for the crossing. Cut them off. Shoot the horses. The chase was on. They tore through the edge of town, scattering chickens and a startled mule skinner. Bullets kicked up dust at their heels. Zip, thwack, ping! A whiskey bottle on a hitching rail 10 feet to Cora's left exploded in a spray of brown glass. She flinched, but didn't slow, clinging to Buck's mane, her knees clamped tight. Danner was riding himself, his mouth peeled back from his teeth like a wolf about to tear its kill. He was a better rider on a better horse, and he was gaining. Ahead, they could hear it before they saw it, a low, angry roar. The Sable Fork crossing. They broke through the last line of cottonwoods and reined in hard, the horses skidding to a stop at the riverbank. It wasn't a river. It was a monster. The spring snowmelt, fast and heavy from the high peaks, had turned the familiar, placid fork into a churning, muddy, white-capped fist. The water was a solid brown wall, moving with terrifying speed, carrying entire trees, their branches like grasping arms. The crossing, usually a gentle, gravel-bottomed ford, was gone, erased by the flood. "We can't," Cora gasped, the spray cold on her face. "It'll kill the horses." Danner and his men were 50 yards behind, closing fast, spreading out, their rifles coming up. Chayton was not looking at the pursuers. He was reading the water. His eyes scanned the churning surface, finding a pattern in the chaos. He pointed, not at the submerged ford, but 50 yards upstream, where the main current slammed against a rocky outcrop, creating a violent swirling eddy on the far side. "There," he said, his voice hard. "It's a slant crossing. The current is mean, but the eddy is slack. It's the only way. Survivable." "They're on us," a rider shouted. The first shot from the posse cracked through the air. "Hold the books," Chayton ordered. He tossed the bundled ledgers to Cora. She fumbled them, her hands numb, but secured them under one arm, pressing them against her ribs. "Ride when I ride." He yelled over the roar. "Do not fight the horse. Let him swim." He kicked the dun. "Ha!" They plunged. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, a solid wall of ice that stole Cora's breath. The horses, in over their heads instantly, screamed, their eyes white. The world dissolved into a chaos of brown water, roaring sound, and frantic, churning limbs. Buck was a strong swimmer, but the current was stronger. It grabbed them, spun them. Cora lost her hat, a gift from her father, and saw it vanish in the roiling foam. She didn't care. She clutched the ledgers, her other hand twisted in Buck's mane. The horse was fighting, trying to turn back, panicking. "Steady! Boy, swim!" she screamed, her voice lost in the river's roar. Chayton was just ahead of her, the dun swimming low, fighting the main current, angling for the far bank. A shot thumped from the bank. It wasn't a crack, but a heavy, wet sound. Chayton grunted, his whole body lurching. He was hit. He twisted on the dun's back, his body instinctively shielding Cora from the shooters on the bank, a move that almost cost him his seat. A second shot zipped past Cora's ear, so close she felt its heat. Chayton was slumped, one arm dangling. The dun, sensing its rider's weakness, began to panic, turning in a circle, about to be swept downstream. Cora refused the panic that was clawing at her throat. "Breathe! Pay me by breathing!" She kicked Buck, driving him closer to Chayton. The horses bumped, their bodies slick and unstable. Chayton was sliding, his eyes glazed with shock. "Chayton!" she screamed. He didn't respond. She let go of the mane, her legs the only anchor. She grabbed the front of his belt, a fistful of leather. "No, you don't." With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hauled on the belt, pulling him upright, and kicked Buck again, driving both horses sideways, out of the mane, deadly current and into the violent, swirling slack of the eddy he had pointed to. The water spun them, but its killing force was gone. It was a mean, churning pool, but it wasn't pulling them downstream to their deaths. Buck's hooves struck gravel. He scrambled, found his footing, and lunged up the steep, muddy bank, dragging the dun with him. Cora and Chayton, still connected by her grip on his belt, sprawled off the horses and onto the far bank, a tangle of wet, shaking limbs. They were alive. They were across. Cora lay on the gravel, coughing up river water, her lungs burning. The first thing she did was check her arm. The ledgers were there, a sodden, heavy mass of leather and paper. But they were there. The leather was swollen, the ink on the pages would be blurred, but she could see the dark lines of script, legible. Behind them, on the far bank, Danner's men were screaming in frustration. Danner, his face purple, pointed downstream, ordering them to find another crossing. Two of the riders spurred their horses into the water, trying to follow. But the river, impartial and furious, took them. One horse was thrown, its rider vanishing, and the other climbed back onto the bank, screaming, its legs cut and bleeding. The pursuit faltered. Danner sat on his black horse, defeated by the water, and just watched them. A statue of pure hate. Cora pushed herself up. Chayton was lying on his side, his face pale as ash, his teeth gritted. His left shoulder was a dark, spreading stain of red, the water from his wet shirt running pink over the gravel. "Breathe," she whispered. The word, a rasp. She crawled to him. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely move. She looked at his wound, then at her own torn skirt. She ripped a long, clean strip from the hem, the cotton surprisingly strong. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain but still sharp. "Expensive. Bandages," he joked, his voice a wet, weak whisper. Cora didn't smile. She finished tying a brutal, tight knot over the wound, packing it with the cloth to staunch the bleeding. She snarled at him, her voice a raw command, a plea, a promise. "Breathe." He closed his eyes. He did. He was a dead weight. The man who had moved like a shadow, who had vaulted onto a bareback horse and read a river like a book, was now a leaden, gasping burden that Cora was half dragging through a thicket of cottonwoods. The storm that had been a distant threat on the ridge was now a present, drowning reality. Rain, cold as the river, hammered them. Every step was a sucking pull in the mud. Chayton stumbled. His good hand clamped over the bloody ruin of his shoulder, his breathing a shallow, ragged grunt. "Just here," he whispered, gesturing with his chin toward a dark shape under the trees. It was a trapper's cabin, or what was left of it, a small, sod-roofed dugout, half collapsed, leaning into the hillside. The door was gone. The front half of the roof was a skeleton of split shingles, but the back half, pressed into the earth, was intact. It was shelter. Cora shoved him through the dark opening, and he collapsed onto the damp, packed earth floor. She fell in after him, dragging the sodden, precious bundle of the ledgers, and lay there for a long moment, her body screaming, her lungs burning, listening to the rain drumming on the remaining shingles. It was a hollow, echoing sound, a counter-rhythm to the blood dripping from Chayton's arm onto the dirt. She pushed herself up. Her hands were numb, her entire body shaking with cold and exhaustion. But the sight of him, pale and still in the gloom, cut through her fatigue. "Cora," he whispered, his eyes closed. "I'm here." She crawled to him. "Don't you move! Don't you dare!" She rummaged in the dark corners of the tiny cabin. There was a rusted, three-legged stool, a scattering of old traps, and, in a dry box built into the wall, a miracle, a tin of matches, a half-burned candle, and a dusty, corked bottle of whiskey. Her hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to strike a match. The flame flared, fragile, and she touched it to the candle wick. A small, golden light pushed back the shadows. Chayton was paler than she'd thought. His lips were blue. The bandage she had tied at the river was soaked through, a dark, glistening red. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice flat. She uncorked the whiskey. The smell, sharp and potent, filled the small space. "Good," he grunted, pushing himself up to a sitting position against the wall. He was breathing through his teeth. She found a folded, stiff piece of leather in his belt pouch, meant for honing a blade. He saw her look at it. "Go on," he panted. He took the leather and folded it, placing it between his teeth. "No," he said, and spat it out. A weak, self-deprecating laugh, which was more of a cough. shook him. "I'm not in a cheap novel. Go on, just do it." Cora nodded, her jaws set. She took a mouthful of the whiskey, swished it to clean her own mouth of the river's filth, and spat it onto the dirt. Then she poured the raw, amber liquid directly onto the wound. Chayton's body went rigid. A long, shuddering hiss, a sound of agony beyond words, was ripped from his chest. His good hand clawed at the dirt floor, his knuckles white, but he did not cry out. Cora did not flinch. She tore another strip from her ruined skirt and, soaking it with the last of the whiskey, began to clean the wound. It was a ragged, deep tear, the bullet having passed clean through the muscle of his shoulder. It was bleeding, but the river had, perhaps, washed it of the worst of the filth. She worked with the sure, steady hands of a woman who had stitched up horses and lanced infections, her movements economical and sure. When she was done, she packed the entry and exit wounds with the cleanest cloth she had and bound his shoulder and chest tightly, a crisscross binding that held the padding in place and immobilized his arm. He was sweating now, a cold, feverish sheen on his skin. He slumped against the wall, his eyes closed. "You're a terrible nurse," he breathed. "I'm alive," she retorted, her voice shaking. "And so are you. Now, rest." She gave him a small sip of the whiskey, which he took reluctantly, and then she turned her attention to the ledgers. She built a small, smoky fire in the ruined hearth, using dry wood she found in the box, and laid the ledgers open near it, the pages steaming. The leather was swollen, the paper warped, but as she had seen, the ink had held. It was blurred, but it was legible. She sat on the rusted stool, moved the candle closer, and began to read. The cabin filled with the sound of the rain drumming on the roof and the soft, dry rustle of the turning pages. And as she read, the shame, anger, and grief from Willow Notch cooled, hardened, and sharpened into a cold, diamond-hard blade of pure, righteous fury. It was all there. It was a map of theft posing as order. She saw her own family's name, the Ashdown claim. 2 entries. The first, a record of property taxes unpaid for 6 months a lie. Her father had paid them in March. She had the receipt, or had until it burned. The second, a lien filed, dated 2 days after the fire. Then the other names, dozens of them, settlers, ranchers, small-time homesteaders. Jedediah Morse, claim at Willow Notch, burned. Title forfeit. Amos Guthrie, claim at Black Mesa Draw, bought for $15. Witness to abandonments and Danner. Silas, Danner's nephew. He had witnessed a dozen abandonments. Then she found the true heart of the darkness, the Pinion Ford General Store purchase ledger. Chayton had not just grabbed the land books. He had grabbed Danner's business accounts. To Ezekiel Danner, 50 gallons lamp oil. Paid. October 10th, the day before her ranch burned. To Ezekiel Danner, 20 repeating rifles. 500 rounds ammunition. Paid. October 14th, the day before the volunteers in army coats rode on Willow Notch. To L. Harmon, $200 for services rendered. Sheriff Lyle Harmon. He hadn't just been bought. He was on a payroll. She read on, her blood turning to ice. Names, dates, false witness statements, payments. It was a meticulous, arrogant record of a conspiracy that had poisoned the entire basin. Danner wasn't just clearing land. He was engineering a war, burning out both settlers and the Hawk Mesa, pinning the blame on each to justify seizing the land from both. "Cora!" Chayton's voice, thick with fever, startled her. She looked over. He was shivering, his eyes open but not seeing her. He was seeing something else. "The fire! It's the roof!" he muttered, his good hand twitching. She left the ledgers and knelt beside him, placing her cool, damp hand on his forehead. He was burning up. "Shh," she said. "The fire is out. We're safe. We're in a cabin." His eyes focused on her, relief washing over his face, followed by a sudden, sharp panic. The river! Danner!" "We're across," she said, her voice low and steady. "Danner is on the other side. You're safe. I'm here." He blinked, his breathing slowing. "Still here," he whispered, the question a plea. "Still here," she affirmed. "Go to sleep." He drifted, his body relaxing. She returned to the ledgers. The rain drummed. An hour passed. "Gone," he moaned. "The cradle burned." She went to him again, her heart aching. She dipped a rag in the water bucket she'd found miraculously full of rainwater from a hole in the roof and bathed his face. "Auntie Saltsage is safe," she whispered, not knowing if it was true, but needing to say it. "The camp is safe. We have the proof. Chayton, we have it all." He surfaced, his eyes finding hers in the gloom. He looked at her, his gaze sharp and clear for a moment. You are still here. I am still here," she said, her voice a vow. "I am not leaving you." He drifted back to sleep. This was their rhythm for the long, dark night. She would read the map of Danner's crimes, her fury building, and he would drift and wake, fighting the ghosts of the fire and the river, and she would pull him back, a living anchor, with the same two words. Still here. Toward morning, the fever seemed to ease. His shivering stopped, and his breathing deepened, becoming the slow, regular breath of true sleep. But the bandage needed changing. The bleeding had slowed, but the cloth was stiff. She built up the fire, warming the last of the water, and moved the candle to the floor beside him. She gently began to unwrap the binding. He woke, not with a start, but with a slow opening of his eyes. He watched her. His gaze was clear, the fever gone, leaving only pain and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She had to unbutton his torn, sodden shirt to get the binding off and properly dress the wound. Her hands, sure and practical, went to the buttons. She did not hesitate. This was a task, like cleaning a rifle, like dressing a wound. But as her fingers brushed the skin of his chest, the air in the tiny cabin changed. It was no longer a hospital. The rain on the roof was the only sound. He did not move. He just watched her face, his dark eyes intense. His gaze was not searching, not pleading. It was a question, asked in total stillness. "Are you here as my nurse, or are you here as the woman who kissed me by the river?" Cora paused, her fingers on the third button. She met his gaze. The rain, the cold, the ledgers, the pain, it all fell away. There was only the silent question in the candlelight. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm here as both." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the river. Her hands, which had been so clinical, so sure, now trembled slightly. She finished unbuttoning the shirt, peeling the wet, torn fabric away from his skin. She cleaned the wound again, this time with a gentleness that was an answer in itself. Her touch lingered. When she was finished, her hands rested on his good shoulder. He did not move. He was giving her all the power, all the choice. She leaned down, slowly, giving him time to turn away, to speak, to stop her. He did not. She kissed him. It was not the fierce, desperate kiss of the storm. It was a kiss that deepened slowly, a careful exploration. It was a kiss of shared breath, of synced heartbeats, of profound, quiet gratitude. His good hand came up, not to pull her closer, but to simply rest on her arm, his thumb tracing the line of her wrist, over the rawhide thong he had given her. Her hands were respectful, her touch gentle, mapping the warmth of his skin, the line of his collarbone, the steady beat of his heart. It was a promise, spoken in the language of touch. "You are alive. I am here." They stayed like that for a long time, the world reduced to the small, warm circle of candlelight, the sound of their breathing, and the steady drum of the rain. Finally, she pulled back, her forehead resting against his temple. His skin was warm. He was alive. They fell asleep just like that, sitting against the damp earth wall, his head resting on her shoulder, her temple against his. Two exhausted survivors clinging to each other in a broken shelter. The candle guttered, sputtered, and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. But the rain had slowed. A steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip had begun, as water threaded from the broken roof into the empty bucket Cora had placed on the floor. Cora woke to the gray, watery light of dawn. The rain had stopped. The air was cold and clean. Her neck was stiff, her body aching. But Chayton was breathing deeply beside her, his fever broken. He woke as she moved, his eyes clearing instantly, his hand moving to his wound. He was a warrior again. "It's dawn," she said, her voice rough from sleep. "Danner," he said, and began to move, to stand. "No," she said, pushing him gently back. "Not yet." "You're weak, but we have to plan." They sat in the cold morning light, the soggy ledgers between them. "We practice our truth-telling," she said, her voice hard, the softness of the night gone. "I will stand in the town hall," she said, touching the books. "Market day is tomorrow. The town will be full. I will stand on the hall steps, and I will read these pages. I will read every name, every date, every dollar." "They will shoot you before you read the second name," Chayton said, his voice flat. "Danner's men, Harmon, they won't let you speak." "That's your part," she said, meeting his gaze. "You won't be beside me. You'll be where they can't see you. You'll be on the roof of the livery, or in the bell tower of the church, a place where rifles can't triangulate the door. You'll be my witness. Chayton, you'll watch for the rifles. You'll stop them before they stop me." He was a scout. He knew angles. He knew how to see without being seen. He studied her, then gave a single, sharp nod. "I will stand where the shot comes from. I will not let them make their story true." The plan was set. A two-person invasion. A sound, a bare whisper of displaced air at the cabin's empty doorway, made them both freeze. Chayton's hand was on his knife. Cora's on the rifle. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the gray light. "It is a poor house that does not welcome a guest," a dry voice said. "Anti-salt Sarge." Cora breathed, lowering the rifle. The old woman stepped inside, her moccasins silent on the dirt floor. She was not wet. She had moved with the storm, not against it. She looked at the cabin, at Chayton's bound shoulder, at the ledgers open on the floor. Her eyes missed nothing. She carried a bundle wrapped in clean cloth. She placed it in Cora's hands. It was bread, fresh, warm, and heavy. The old woman's eyes met Cora's, and in their depths, Cora saw a universe of pride and a terrible, heartbreaking plea. Pride that they had survived, that they had the books, a plea that it would be enough. "You have his paper," Anti-Salt Sage said, nodding at the ledgers. "We do," Cora said. "We will show the town. We will stop him." Anti-Salt Sage's face tightened. "You must hurry. Danner does not only ride with ink, he rides with God, now." "What do you mean?" Chayton asked, his voice low. "My granddaughter, who cleans the church, she heard them," the old woman said, her voice bitter. "Danner has bribed the new post chaplain. Tomorrow, at the market, the chaplain will give a sermon from the town hall steps. He will bless the land clearing. He will tell the town that the fires at Willow Notch and Salt Willow are God's will, a divine clearing of the land for a new, blessed purpose. He is going to baptize Danner's theft in holy water." Cora stared at her, the enormity of Danner's evil settling on her. He was complete. He had the law, the guns, and now the pulpit. He was making himself a god in the basin. Cora's jaw hardened. She picked up the heaviest ledger, the one with the purchase receipts, and felt its solid, damp weight in her hands. She looked from the bread to the old woman's hopeful, pleading face. "Then we'll baptize him in paper." The town green of Pinyon Ford was swollen, a sea of anxious, weary faces. Market day usually had a festive air, a bustle of trade and gossip. Today, it felt like a funeral. The air, thick with dust and the smell of livestock, was heavy with unspoken fear, with the rumors of the Willow Notch fire and the smoke that had stained the sky for days. On the newly built review stand in front of the town hall, Ezekiel Danner stood, his hands clasped behind his back. He was not dressed as a cattle baron, but as a statesman, in a clean black frock coat and string tie. Beside him sat the new post chaplain, a thin man with a nervous cough, and Sheriff Lyle Harmon, who looked out over the crowd with a tired, hollow expression. His new deputies fanned out below the stand. Danner raised a hand, and the low, nervous murmur of the crowd died. "Friends, neighbors," Danner began, his voice rolling, full of false sympathy. "These are dark days, days of trial. We have suffered a great loss. We have seen the savagery of the renegade, the flame of chaos at our very borders. We have seen our own neighbors, like the good Ashdowns, burned out by a menace we have ignored for too long." He paused, letting the fear sink in. "But I say to you, this is not an ending, this is a beginning, a cleansing with the blessing of our new spiritual guide, Chaplain Davies, and the ironclad authority of the law." He gestured to Harmon. "We have established a new peace detail, Camp Laurel, a place of safety. A new order is coming to this basin. An order of progress, of prosperity, of safety." The chaplain nodded, clearing his throat. "Mr. Danner is a savior, sent by Providence to tame this wild land." "He's a liar." The voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the chaplain's nervous words like a scythe. The crowd turned. A gap formed. Cora Ashdown was walking through the dust, not from the street, but from the alley beside the general store. She was not the same woman who had fled the basin. Her hair was matted, her dress was still torn and stained with river mud and Chayton's blood, and her face was a mask of cold, hard fury. She looked like a ghost, a prophet returned from the wilderness, and she was not alone. At her side, walking reluctantly, his face pale and sweating, was Mr. Thorne, the editor of the Pinion Clarion. He was carrying nothing, but his presence was a statement. "What is this?" Danner demanded, his genial mask slipping. "Sheriff, this woman is clearly not well. She suffered a trauma." Cora ignored him. She ignored the rifles of the deputies turning toward her. She walked to the base of the stand, to the set of rough-hewn stairs. Chayton was not with her. He was, as they had planned, a ghost somewhere high, his wounded shoulder packed and bound, his eye on the rifles, not the speaker. She climbed the stairs. "Miss Ashdown." "Cora," Danner said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Go home. Go to the clinic. We are handling this." "You are handling nothing," Cora said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "You are celebrating." She reached the top of the stand. The two sodden, warped, leather-bound books were in a sack on her shoulder. With a single, fluid motion, she swung the sack and slammed the ledgers down on the railing in front of Danner. Thud! The sound was final, heavy as a coffin lid. The crowd surged forward. Curious. "What is the meaning of this?" Danner snapped, his face turning a dark red. "This," Cora said, her hand flat on the swollen leather, "is your providence, Mr. Danner. This is your order. This is your map of theft. You didn't just come to tame the land, you came to steal it." A gasp went through the crowd. Mr. Thorne, the editor, looked like he was going to be sick. "She's mad," Danner shouted. "Caesar, read it, Mr. Thorne," Cora commanded. "You're a man of the press, or are you just a man of the payroll?" Thorne flinched. He looked at Danner, at the armed deputies, and then at the ledger Cora had just flipped open. He saw the neat columns, the ink, the truth. "She—" Thorne swallowed, his voice a dry croak. "She has a right to be heard. Then I will read it myself," Cora said. She turned to the crowd, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute certainty. "You all knew my father. You know he paid his taxes. But this book," she slapped the ledger, "says he was in arrears. This book, Danner's book, says a lien was filed. 2 days after my ranch was burned to the ground by men Danner himself paid." A low murmur started. "What? Paid?" "Oh, yes," Cora said, her eyes finding faces in the crowd. He kept records. He's an arrogant man. He wrote it all down. He bought his supplies from the general store. He bought 50 gallons of lamp oil on October 10th, the day before my fire. The murmur grew, becoming a low growl. Men were looking at each other, the math clicking into place. "And what about Willow Notch?" she cried, her voice breaking with rage. "You all heard it was a renegade raid. Danner told you that? His newspaper told you that, but his book." She flipped a page, the wet paper tearing slightly. His book tells a different story, October 14th. 20 repeating rifles, 500 rounds ammunition. A gift to his peace detail. The volunteers in army coats. She wasn't done. And the land. What about the land? Her finger, stained with ash and ink, ran down a list. Amos Guthrie claim at Black Mesa Draw. Burned by renegades. Title purchased by Ezekiel Danner for $15. "That's a lie," a man shouted from the crowd. "Amos wouldn't sell." "He didn't," Cora shouted back. "He was burned out, and Jedediah Morse and the widow Allen all burned by renegades. All their parcels signed over to shellmen, to companies Danner owns, signed just hours after the ashes cooled." She found the last entry she had memorized. "And how do we know they were renegades? We have an eyewitness, a paid eyewitness." She read the line, her voice dripping with contempt. "Payment to Silas Danner, $50 for services rendered. Silas, his own nephew, a man who was seen drunk in the saloon that entire night, paid to swear he saw savages at Willow Notch." The crowd was a simmering pot, ready to boil over. The murmurs had become shouts. Thief, liar, murderer, and then a sound pierced the noise. It was not a shout. It was a single, high, agonizing wail of pure, laminated grief. A woman shoved her way to the front of the crowd, her face raw. It was Mrs. Guthrie, Amos's wife, a survivor from Willow Notch. She stared at Danner, her eyes wide, unblinking. My boy!" She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "He burned my son. He burned my Samuel in his own bed, my Samuel." The field went utterly, terribly still. The name, Samuel, hung in the air, a testament to a small, specific life. The abstract menace Danner had preached about suddenly had a name. The crime was no longer about land or oil. It was about a child. That was the moment Danner lost. His face contorted, the mask of the Savior gone, replaced by the naked face of a wolf. He lunged, not at Cora, but at the books. He had to destroy the proof. "No!" he roared. He never reached them. A shadow detached itself from the awning of the livery stable adjacent to the stand. It was not a jump. It was a drop. Chayton Redbird landed on the stand, silent as a hawk. Between Danner and Cora, he was unarmed. His left arm was bound tightly to his chest, the shoulder of his shirt still dark with the blood from the river. He said nothing. He just stood there, his presence an absolute, undeniable fact. Danner's new deputies, the men who had been called volunteers, raised their rifles, their sights finding the chest of the lone Hawk Mesa man. And they hesitated. Their rifles wavered, held in a moment of suspended breath. This was not a renegade. This was not a savage. This was an unarmed, wounded man standing in broad daylight, protecting a white woman from the man who paid them. The story Danner had built, the lie they had been told, shattered on the unblinking, steady gaze of Chayton Redbird. The chaplain, seeing the tide turn, tried to regain control. He stepped forward, his hands raised. "My children, this is the work of the devil. He is using this woman's grief to sow discord. The scripture tells us, 'Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord.' And what does the grass say?" A new voice, dry and clear as the desert air, came from the crowd. Auntie Salt Sage stepped out from beside Mrs. Guthrie, her face a map of ancient authority. She looked not at Danner, but at the chaplain. "You speak of your book. Holy man," she said, her voice carrying across the silent green. "But you do not read the land. What does the creek say? Now that it runs with the ash of our homes, what does the wind say? Now that it carries the name Samuel, you cannot baptize this. Grief speaks fluent human, and this town," she swept her arm wide, "is full of it." The crowd listened. They understood the wind. They understood the name. Danner, frantic, his eyes wild, turned on his last line of defense. "Harmon Sheriff, do your duty. Arrest this woman for sedition. Arrest him." He pointed at Chayton. "Arrest them both." Sheriff Lyle Harmon had not moved. He stood, his gaze fixed, not on Danner, not on Cora, but on the open page of the ledger. Cora, seeing his gaze, slid the book closer to him. Her finger tapped the last line she had found. "Payment to L. Harmon, $200 for services rendered." The sheriff looked at the ink. He looked at his own name, written in Danner's arrogant hand. He realized, in that cold, sickening moment, that Danner had kept a receipt. He was not a partner, he was an expense, and he was now tied to a man who had murdered a child. Self-preservation, the truest law in Pinyon Ford, made the choice for him. He looked at Danner, his face pale, his hand, which had been resting on his pistol, slowly, deliberately moved away. He lowered his hand. "No," Harmon said, his voice quiet. "What?" Danner shrieked. "No!" In the crowd, the hot-headed youth, Teller Knox, saw his chance. He saw Danner, the man who had ordered the burning of his cousin's cradle, standing exposed. He wanted blood, not justice. He grabbed for a pistol tucked in the belt of the man beside him. Chayton moved. He was on Knox before the man's fingers had even closed on the gun's grip. It was not a fight. It was a redirection. With his one good arm, Chayton used open hands, not fists. Turning Knox's lunge, sweeping his foot, Teller Knox went down, hard, on his back in the dust. The wind knocked out of him. The gun skittering away. The crowd saw it. Skill without cruelty. Defense without malice. Chayton hadn't hurt the man. He had simply stopped him. The spell was broken. Mr. Thorne, the editor, his shirt soaked with sweat, saw the sheriff's refusal, saw the crowd's new hard-edged fury. He made his choice. We will print an extra," he shouted, his voice cracking. "These pages, the Clarion will print these pages. The whole territory must know." Two printers' boys, sensing history, raced from the crowd toward the newspaper office. Danner was trapped. His lies were read. His law had abandoned him. His church had been silenced. His proof had been disarmed. He was just a man, a murderer, with a scream of pure, animal rage. He drew his own revolver. He didn't aim at Cora. He aimed at the man who was the living symbol of his defeat. He aimed at Chayton. The world slowed. The click of the hammer being pulled back was deafening. Cora did not think. She acted. She drove her shoulder hard into Danner's gun arm, just as he pulled the trigger. Boom! The shot went skyward, deafening, blowing a hole in the clear blue sky. A flock of pigeons, nesting in the bell tower, exploded into the air, a panic of wings. The sound broke the town's paralysis. "Get him!" a man roared. A fist of Danner's most loyal riders. The ones paid for guns, not just lies, charged the stand, their own pistols drawn. But the townsfolk surged with them. It was a wave of farmers, merchants, and widows, a mob driven not by hate, but by a terrible, righteous fury. They swarmed the stand, overwhelming the deputies. "Seize him!" Sheriff Harmon bellowed, finding his voice at last, pointing at his former employer. "Seize Ezekiel Danner." Seeing it was over, shoved the chaplain into the path of the mob, kicked Cora in the chest to clear his way, and leaped from the back of the stand. His black stallion was tethered there. He cut the rope, threw himself onto its back, and spurred the horse, hard, out of the square. He fled, not for the road, but for the open country, for the chert ridge. Cora, gasping for breath, her chest aching, locked eyes with Chayton. It was not over. Justice was not in the town hall. It was in the books, and the man who wrote them was escaping. Chayton ran for Buck, who was tethered nearby. He swung onto the gelding's back and reached down his one good hand. Cora took it, and he hauled her up behind him. They gave chase, the two of them on one horse, thundering out of the town square, leaving the chaos of their revelation behind. They rode into the sharp, bright stormlight of the open prairie, a two-person posse hunting the man who had tried to burn their world. The thunder was a deep, guttural growl that rolled across the basin from the direction of Crow Ladder Butte. It was the voice of the storm, and it was the sound of their pursuit. Cora clung to Chayton, her body pressed against his back, feeling the tense coil of his muscles with every stride of the horse. Buck, the gelding, was running on pure heart, his breath tearing in his chest, his hooves sinking into the rain-softened earth. They were gaining. Danner's big black stallion was a powerful animal, but it was heavy, and the slick, treacherous ground was its enemy. Danner rode with the frantic desperation of a cornered animal, looking back over his shoulder, his face a white smudge of terror and rage. The chase led them up into the broken land at the foot of the butte, a landscape of sharp-edged rock and slick, pale soil. It was caliche, a hard pan that turned to greasy mud in the rain. It happened fast. Danner's horse, taking a steep incline, lost its footing. Its legs went out from under it in a chaotic slide. The stallion screamed as it went down, rolling, and Danner was thrown clear, landing hard in the mud. He scrambled to his feet, his fine black coat ripped and smeared with filth. The horse lay on the ground, its foreleg bent at an impossible angle. Danner didn't even glance at the animal. He just ran, scrambling on foot up the knife edge of the chert ridge. Chayton reined Buck in at the bottom of the ridge. "He's trapped," Chayton said, his voice a low pant. He slid from the horse's back, his one good hand steadying himself. Cora was down a second later, her legs shaking from the ride. "Stay with the horse," Chayton commanded. "Like hell," Cora retorted, pulling the rifle from its makeshift scabbard. "We end this together." He looked at her, at the hard line of her jaw, and gave a single, sharp nod. They climbed, the wind whipping at them, the rain plastering their hair to their faces. They found him on the summit, a narrow spine of rock with a sheer drop on either side. He was a silhouette against the churning, bruised sky, a pathetic, mud-stained king of a barren rock. He saw them coming and raised his revolver, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he shrieked, his voice high and thin, stripped of all its commanding thunder. It was the voice of a spoiled child whose toys had been taken away. "I'll shoot, I swear to God. I'll kill you both." He swung the revolver from Cora to Chayton and back again, his movements jerky, unpredictable. Chayton stopped, positioning himself slightly ahead of Cora, his body a shield. Cora, however, did not stop. She kept walking, slowly, deliberately closing the angle, her rifle held low, not aimed. "There is no God on this ridge. Ezekiel," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the wind. "Just us, just the rocks and the rain. You ruined me," he screamed. "My town, my order." "It was never your town," Cora said, taking another slow step. "You just rented it. You burned your neighbors. Danner, you burned their homes, their children, to buy their sorrow cheap. You think this land will forget that?" She took another step. She was close now, almost close enough to touch him. The grass remembers the fire, the creek remembers the ash, the stone remembers the blood, the land remembers everything. A brilliant, blinding fork of lightning split the sky directly overhead. For a split second, the world was stark white and black, a photograph of their final confrontation. The thunderclap that followed was instantaneous, a deafening physical blow that shook the very rock beneath their feet. Danner screamed, a pure, animal sound of terror. He fired wildly, a panicked, blind shot. The muzzle flash, a brief, violent flower of orange in the gloom, blinded him long enough. Chayton moved. He was not a brawler. He was a force of nature. In the half-second of Danner's blindness, he closed the distance. He did not strike. He did not grapple. With his one good hand, he simply hooked Danner's wrist, the one holding the gun, and used the man's own forward momentum to turn him, to spin him off balance. Danner stumbled. his feet slipping on the wet rock, and went down hard on his face, the revolver skittering away, clattering against the stone. It was over. Cora stood over him, the man who had burned her barn, who had nearly killed her mother, who had murdered families and stolen a future. He was a sniveling, mud-caked heap at her feet. Revenge trembled in her like a drawn bow. The rifle in her hands felt heavy, an extension of her own righteous fury. It would be so easy. A single, final act of justice. An eye for an eye. A fire for a fire. She looked at his pathetic, shaking form. She saw the empty cradle at Willow Notch. She saw her mother's terrified face. She saw the smoke, the lies, the greed. She felt the cool, smooth weight of the heartstone in her pocket. Stone can be carried? She looked at Chayton, who was watching her, his face grim, his expression unreadable. He was leaving the choice to her. This was her justice to claim. She lowered the rifle. The hammer clicked softly as she eased it down. She walked past Danner and retrieved his revolver, tucking it into her own belt. Then she knelt beside him. He flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, she reached to her own wrist and, with deliberate fingers, untied the rawhide water thong, the simple strip of leather he had given her, the one that had taught her to sip, not swallow, the one that had reminded her to live. She took Danner's hands, which were soft and uncalloused, and bound them tightly behind his back with the thong. It was not a binding of rope or iron. It was a binding of memory, of survival. Danner stared at her, his face a mask of confusion. What are you doing?" "This isn't your judgment, Ezekiel," Cora said, her voice cold and clear as the rain. She hauled him roughly to his feet. "You don't get the clean death of a bullet on a lonely ridge. Your justice is waiting for you down there, with the people you lied to, with the memories you created." She shoved him forward, toward the path down. "Face them!" She began dragging him back toward town. A single, determined woman hauling the devil by a leather string. Chayton watched her, and a new softness entered his eyes. He saw not weakness, but a strength he had never known. A mercy that was hotter and sharper than any fire. He saw a justice that healed instead of just hurt. They met the town at the river, a crowd, led by Sheriff Harmon and a now somber Mr. Thorne, was waiting for them on the bank. They had come not as a mob, but as a jury. They took Danner from her without a word. They hauled him, stumbling and weeping, to the stone jailhouse and locked him inside. They watched as Mr. Thorne, his face set with a new, grim purpose, unlocked the door to the Clarion office, the two printers' boys at his heels. They saw Chaplain Davies, his face gray with shame, step down from the review stand and disappear into the church. A man seeking a god he had forgotten, later, as the storm passed and a clean, watery sunset painted the sky. Cora and Chayton stood under a massive cottonwood tree, at the place where Salt Willow Basin met the Sable Fork. The world was quiet, washed clean. Cora leaned into Chayton, her head resting on his good shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his warmth a solid, living truth. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the river, the water level already receding, its anger spent. She turned her head, looking up at him. They kissed. It was not a kiss of discovery or of desperation, but a kiss of arrival. It was the quiet, steady kiss of two people who had walked through fire and flood and had earned the right to this small, simple peace. She pulled back just enough to speak, her breath warm against his jaw. The words a soft, final promise that was the truest vow she would ever make. "You saved what was left of my heart," she whispered. "So, tonight, I'll give you the rest of it." They did not talk of leaving. They talked of building. They planned a two-home life, a life that honored both their worlds. A new cabin would be built at Salt Willow, wider and stronger than before, its doors open to the east. And a winter shelter would be waiting at Hawk Mesa, a place where songs were shared and stories were told. Their work would be braided, she had said, not blended. two strong ropes making a single, unbreakable bond. The last image of Pinyon Ford was of the dawn. The first rays of sun touched the town, lighting the windows of the Clarion office, where the printing presses were already running, slinging ink, sending the truth out on paper wings, on the dusty ground in front of the jailhouse, where a defeated man sat in the dark. Two children had come out to play, their laughter echoing in the clean morning air as they chalked the first hopeful squares of a hopscotch game. Truth rides slow, but it rides. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world.